Imagine this. An empire so powerful that it controls 3 continents, Europe, Asia, Africa, the strongest army of its time, the most strategic trade routes on Earth, a capital city no rival could breach. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire looked permanent. And yet, it collapsed. Not because enemies defeated it, not because its soldiers forgot how to fight, but because it ignored one warning that every empire receives. A warning America is ignoring right now. Different century, different technology, same mistake. At its peak, the Ottoman Empire was not weak. It controlled the gateway between East and West, global trade routes linking Europe and Asia, strategic seas, straits, and choke points. A military feared across continents. For hundreds of years, the Ottomans weren't just a power, they were the system. If trade moved between continents, it passed through Ottoman land. If empires wanted access, they negotiated with Istanbul. From the outside, the empire looked unshakable, but internally something dangerous was happening. The Ottomans began confusing control with adaptation, and that confusion is fatal for empires. The warning, the Ottomans ignored. The warning wasn't military, it wasn't economic collapse, it wasn't rebellion, it was change. Europe was transforming. New technology, new financial systems, new methods of war, new trade routes bypassing old ones. But the Ottoman system didn't evolve. Instead of adapting, it doubled down on control. More bureaucracy, more centralized power, more rigid rules. The empire believed what worked for centuries will always work. That belief blinded them. Power without reform is a trap. The Ottomans still had armies. They still collected taxes. They still ruled vast territory. So leaders assumed reform wasn't urgent. This is the most dangerous phase of empire. When the system still functions, but only because it hasn't been tested yet. Instead of modernizing institutions, the empire focused on maintaining authority. Instead of innovation, it relied on tradition. Instead of flexibility, it chose obedience. This created stability on it, but only on the surface. Underneath, competitiveness was disappearing. Trade routes changed, the empire didn't. Here's a key moment most people miss. When Europeans discovered new sea routes, global trade began shifting away from Ottoman-controlled land routes. Revenue declined, influence weakened. But the Ottomans responded the wrong way. Instead of reforming their economy, they tightened control over what remained. Higher taxes, more regulation, less incentive for growth. This didn't strengthen the empire. It slowly hollowed it out. Why this matters for America? Because this pattern should feel familiar. America today still controls key global systems, dominates financial infrastructure, maintains worldwide military reach. From the outside, it looks unstoppable. But internally, institutions are rigid, reform is delayed, debt is rising, adaptation is slow, just like the Ottoman Empire at its peak. The Ottomans ignored the warning signs because power still worked. America is making the same assumption. The Ottoman Empire didn't collapse suddenly. It locked itself into decline. And it happened the moment the empire chose control over adaptation. This is the mistake America is closest to making today. The turning point. Most history books skip by the 17th century. The Ottoman Empire faced a clear choice. Europe was changing fast. New military technology, new banking systems, new political institutions, new methods of taxation and production. The Ottomans noticed these changes, but instead of copying or adapting them, they rejected them. Why? Because reform threatens authority, and empires at their peak fear losing control more than losing relevance. So the Ottoman leadership made a critical decision. We will preserve order, not transform the system. That choice sealed their fate. Military strength became a weakness. The Ottomans still had a powerful army, so they used it, constantly. More troops, more suppression, more enforcement. But here's the trap. Military power can hold territory, but it cannot fix institutions. As Europe modernized its armies, finances, and governance together, the Ottomans focused almost entirely on enforcement. The empire became very good at maintaining control and very bad at creating growth. This imbalance is deadly. Refusing reform was cheaper. At first, reform is expensive. It angers elites. It disrupts traditions. It risks short-term instability. So instead of reforming tax systems, education, financial institutions, the Ottomans preserved the old structure. On paper, this looked stable. In reality, it meant slower productivity, declining innovation, rising corruption, loss of competitiveness. But because the empire still existed, leaders assumed everything was fine. That illusion lasted generations. The empire began reacting, not leading. This is the moment empires lose direction. Instead of shaping the future, they start responding to threats. Trade declined implies raise taxes. Revenue fell implies borrow more and rest. Rose implies deploy soldiers. Every response treated symptoms, not causes. And every response increased dependence on force. Sound familiar? The American parallel is uncomfortable. America today still has unmatched military reach, control over global finance, dominance in institutions, so it keeps using them. Sanctions instead of reform, debt instead of restructuring, pressure instead of adaptation. Just like the Ottomans, America isn't collapsing, it's reacting. And reaction is not strategy. The most dangerous phase of empire history shows this clearly. Empires don't fail when they lose power. They fail when power replaces reform. The Ottoman Empire ignored this warning. America is staring at the same one. The Ottoman Empire didn't lose because it ran out of land. It lost because it ran out of economic flexibility. And once that happens, power becomes expensive, fast. When the money system stops. Working by the 18th century, the Ottoman economy was under pressure, not because of one crisis, but because the world economy had changed and the empire hadn't. Europe was building modern banking, credit systems, industrial production, global trade finance. The Ottomans were still relying on outdated taxation, land-based revenue, state-controlled monopolies. At first, this didn't look dangerous. The empire was large, taxes still came in, trade still existed. But underneath, something critical broke. Revenue growth slowed, while costs kept rising. That gap never closes on its own. Borrowing felt like a solution. To cover rising expenses, especially military costs, the Ottomans turned to borrowing. European banks were happy to lend. Why? Because the empire looked stable, because it controlled key trade routes, because lenders believed the empire was too big to fail. This is where the trap snapped shut. Debt created short-term relief and long-term dependence. Soon, tax revenue went to interest payments. Economic policy favored creditors. Reforms were delayed to avoid instability. The empire was no longer managing its economy. It was servicing it. Sovereignty was lost. Quietly. Here's the part most people miss. The Ottomans weren't conquered first. They were financially constrained. European creditors demanded guarantees. Customs revenues were pledged. Economic decisions required foreign approval. By the time the Ottomans realized this, their independence had already eroded, not with invasion, with contracts. Why this matters for America. America's economy is far stronger than the Ottoman Empire's ever was, but the pattern is what matters, not the scale. Today, interest payments are rising fast. Debt refinancing is becoming expensive. Financial decisions increasingly limit political choices. Just like the Ottomans, America still looks dominant, and that's the danger, because debt doesn't announce collapse. It narrows options quietly. From leadership to constraint. Once an empire reaches this stage, every crisis costs more, every response is weaker, every decision favors stability over progress. The Ottomans kept borrowing to avoid reform. It bought time, not solutions. And time funded by debt always comes with conditions. The point of no return. The Ottomans didn't collapse the moment debt rose. They crossed the line when debt became structural. When growth couldn't outpace obligations, reform threatened creditors, power existed, but flexibility didn't. That's when decline became inevitable. The Ottoman Empire didn't collapse the moment it lost money. It collapsed when it lost decision-making power. That shift didn't happen overnight. It happened quietly, through advisors, agreements, and assistance, from rulers to managers. As debt mounted, European powers offered help, not invasion, not threats, advice, financial experts, economic reforms, administrative restructuring. On paper, this looked like modernization. In reality, it transferred control. Customs revenue was supervised. Budgets were monitored. Spending priorities were questioned. The empire still existed. The flag still flew. But choices were no longer sovereign. The psychology of dependence. This is where empires become trapped, because once influence replaces control, pushing back risks. Economic collapse, accepting guidance feels safer. Reform becomes conditional. Ottoman leaders believed, if we cooperate, stability will return. But stability built on external approval is fragile. Every decision required reassurance to creditors, allies, and foreign interests. The empire began governing for confidence, not strength. Foreign influence becomes structural. Eventually, foreign influence stopped being external. It became embedded. European powers shaped trade terms, influenced military procurement, dictated financial restructuring. The Ottomans weren't overthrown. They were outgrown by the system around them. This is how modern decline works, not with conquest, with integration that favors others. The American parallel is uncomfortable. America still sets many rules, but the cost of enforcing them is rising. Sanctions require coordination, debt requires confidence, global leadership requires buy-in, and buy-in is conditional. Just like the Ottomans, America increasingly must reassure markets, negotiate with allies, manage perception constantly. That's not weakness, it's constraint. When power needs permission, the Ottomans learned a brutal lesson. Power that requires permission is no longer power. When every move must be justified, not domestically, but externally, control has already shifted. Today, America faces similar friction. Global institutions push back, partners hedge their bets, alternatives quietly form, no single challenger, just reduced compliance. That's more dangerous than opposition. The lock-in effect. Once foreign influence becomes structural, reversal becomes nearly impossible. Why? Because pulling back spooks markets, scares allies, accelerates decline. The Ottomans tried late reforms. They came too late, because the system they depended on was the same system limiting them. The real warning. The warning the Ottomans ignored wasn't military. It was this. When stability depends on external confidence, sovereignty becomes temporary. America is not there yet. But the direction matters more than the position. The Ottoman Empire didn't disappear because it was invaded. It disappeared because it waited too long to choose. By the time leaders understood what was happening, the options were gone. That's the final warning. The moment. Every empire faces. Every empire reaches a point where power still exists, but flexibility doesn't. The Ottomans reached that moment in the late 19th century. They still had territory, armies, legitimacy, but they no longer controlled finances, trade priorities, reform timelines. That's the difference between having power and being able to use it. Why late reforms? The Ottomans eventually tried to modernize. New constitutions, military reforms, administrative changes. But reform requires margin. By then, debt was locked in, foreign influence was embedded, political resistance was high, reform threatened stability, and stability was already fragile, so reform slowed, compromises grew, delay became policy. That sealed the outcome. The illusion that kills empires. The Ottomans believed one dangerous idea. We still have time. Empires almost always believe this, because systems don't break all at once. They degrade, quietly, gradually, then suddenly. Why America's window is still open. This is where the comparison matters. America still has monetary independence, military flexibility, institutional credibility. But the window isn't infinite. The question is not, is America collapsing? The real question is America adjusting early or delaying like the Ottomans? The only two paths forward. History shows empires get only two real options. Early adjustment, reduce commitments, accept smaller control zones, rebuild internally and preserve influence. This looks like weakness short term, but it extends relevance long term. Delay denial, maintain appearances, borrow credibility, push pressure outward, escalate costs. This feels strong until options vanish. The Ottomans chose delay. The modern trap. In today's world, delay is more dangerous. Why? Because markets react instantly, capital moves globally, narratives spread in minutes. There is no slow decline anymore, only compressed outcomes. The final lesson. The Ottoman Empire didn't lose because it lacked strength. It lost because it protected symbols over structure, stability over sustainability, delay over decision. That's the warning, not collapse, choice. The ending. History rarely tells empires don't fall when they're weak. They fall when they refuse to redefine power while they still can. The Ottomans waited. History didn't. America hasn't decided yet. But history doesn't pause. If you want to understand how modern power actually ends and survives, subscribe.